Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into something that honestly completely blew my mind and changed how I look at the human brain. You know that feeling like certain memories or deep fears are just permanently hardwired in there? Well, what we're looking at today is going to totally flip that script. We're exploring the actual science of rapidly rewiring traumatic memories. It's an absolutely wild journey into the neurobiology of fear. Let's get into it. So consider this. What if a lifelong phobia or a deeply traumatic memory could just vanish? And I mean vanish in a single session. Now, I know exactly what you're thinking. You're like, okay, come on, there is no way. That sounds way too good to be true. And honestly, you have every right to be skeptical. For decades, we've been told that healing from deep-seated trauma means months or even years of really grueling, exhausting work. But what if the brain actually has a built-in shortcut? Check out this incredible observation straight from the clinical literature. It says that the vast majority of sufferers experience a significant reduction in their symptoms following one session, without reliving unpleasant events. Right off the bat, I want to be super clear. We're not talking about magic here. It's not some parlor trick. This is a highly documented clinical outcome, completely grounded in the hard neuroscience of how our brains code information. And the absolute best part? You don't have to drag someone through the painful mud of their past to get there. Section 1. A rapid trauma solution. Now, you might see this protocol pop up under a few different names out there. It originally started as the NLP fast phobia model, but today, in modern clinical trauma settings, you'll usually hear it called the rewind technique, or sometimes the visual kinesthetic dissociation protocol. Kind of a mouthful, I know. But regardless of what you call it, the main goal is exactly the same: rapidly neutralizing those intense fears, phobias, and even PTSD by actually changing how the brain internalizes and codes these highly charged experiences. Section 2. Decoupling fear from memory. Think of this whole thing like a giant decoupling mechanism. See, in a traumatized brain, the sensory details of an event, like what you saw or heard, they get super glued to a physical fight or flight panic response. It's literally like the brain's internal fire alarm gets permanently jammed in the on position. Whenever something triggers it, boom, logic goes right out the window and it hits the panic button. What this intervention does is systematically uncouple that historical visual memory from the physical panic. So the brain keeps all the factual data, like you still know the event happened, but that physiological terror, totally disconnected. You're left with just a neutral historical fact instead of a living nightmare. Section 3. The science of reconsolidation. Let's talk about memory reconsolidation. This right here is the master key. This is why the fast phobia model works and why it works permanently. For the longest time, scientists thought that once a long-term memory was formed, it was locked away in a vault, unchangeable, right? Well, modern neuroscience has actually shown us that when a memory gets retrieved under very specific conditions, it temporarily enters this destabilized fluid state. During this tiny window of neuroplasticity, you can literally update the memory or strip away its emotional charge, right before the brain packs it away back into storage. It's a real game changer. And there is a really sharp contrast here with traditional trauma therapy. Normally, approaches like prolonged exposure rely on something called extinction learning. That basically means repeatedly exposing you to the fear until the brain builds a new, competing safe memory over it. But here's the catch. That old terrifying memory, it's still in there. The fear can always spontaneously recover. But the rewind technique leverages memory reconsolidation instead. It doesn't just slap a new memory on top. It goes in and permanently alters the original memory trace. Once you decouple the fear during that neuroplastic window, that's it. The change is permanent. Okay, so let's quickly walk through what's actually happening in the brain here. First, the memory destabilizes. Second, we get a prediction error. And this is the absolute biological genius of the whole thing. A prediction error is basically a massive mismatch between what the traumatized brain fully expects to happen, which is extreme danger and panic, and what actually happens. By conceptually processing the memory in a safe, rapidly altered, distanced way, it totally contradicts the brain's expectation. This mismatch literally forces the brain to rewrite that fear code into a neutral state. Then, step 3, the memory reconsolidates, but this time, zero panic. Section 4. Healing without reliving. Because of how this mechanism works, it opens the door to something called content-free therapy, which is honestly brilliant. Since the intervention relies entirely on how the brain internally structures the imagery to create that prediction error, there is zero requirement for a client to actually talk about the intimate, painful details of their trauma. They literally do not have to sit there and narrate the worst day of their life out loud.
That's revolutionary. It protects vulnerable clients from being re-traumatized during therapy, and equally importantly, it protects clinicians from secondary trauma and burnout. It's highly effective, but completely private.
0%. That's the dropout rate for the active treatment group in a major 2023 clinical trial evaluating this technique. Let me repeat that, 0%. Every single person who dropped out of the study was in the waitlist control group. Just think about that for a second. Trauma therapy is notoriously grueling, and sadly, patients often quit before they can even heal. Seeing a 0% dropout rate, that perfectly illustrates just how tolerable, painless, and acceptable this process is compared to traditional exposure methods.
Section 5. Real-world success stories. Now, the real-world applications for this are incredibly diverse. We're looking at documented sources of just everyday people overcoming lifelong, completely paralyzing phobias, things like heights, spiders, public speaking. But it goes so much deeper. We have clinical data showing military veterans finding total relief from decades of intrusive combat memories, studies tracking police officers who successfully eliminated persistent flashbacks, and, perhaps most astonishingly, there's an evaluation showing survivors of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, people who endured unimaginable extreme violence, achieving rapid, significant symptom reduction literally 14 years after the trauma. This technique works across a massive spectrum of human suffering. When you actually look at the empirical tracking, the success rates are just staggering. Take the Albuquerque trainee study, for example. This tracked real-world applications by newly certified practitioners. Out of 85 clients who went through the short-term treatment, a massive 95% scored completely below the minimal diagnostic criteria for PTSD, right after the intervention. Just to put that into perspective, that means after just 1 to 3 sessions, 95% of these individuals no longer qualified as having PTSD. The data consistently shows these reliable, massive symptom reductions across all kinds of demographics. Which brings us to a super rigorous, randomized controlled trial out of Cardiff University. Because of pandemic restrictions, they actually had to evaluate the rewind technique delivered completely remotely, over video calls. And the results? Absolutely astounding. The treatment group saw a 48.4% overall reduction in clinical PTSD symptoms. That is a huge effect size. And even better, at the 16-week follow-up, there was 0 relapse. They fully maintained all their improvements. It really proved just how incredibly effective and accessible this therapy is, showing that you can rapidly stabilize traumatized individuals even through a computer screen. So, as we unlock the brain's actual biological ability to seamlessly rewrite fear through memory reconsolidation, you really have to wonder, how many millions of people could finally reclaim their peace without the agony of reliving their past? The democratization of rapid, content-free trauma care isn't just some far-off possibility anymore. It's a scientific reality, and it's unfolding right now. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this explainer today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.